Who is Khalid ibn Waleed? Khalid ibn Waleed is the son of Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira. He is one of the most famous amongst the minds of the Muslims. Khalid ibn Waleed, in terms of characteristics and how he looked, the books of history mention that he was relatively light-skinned. When the Arabs say light-skinned, they don't mean white, they mean light brown. And he was very similar looking to Umar ibn al-Khattab. So broad shoulders, very big beard, and muscular. So you can imagine then the bulkiness of Umar, the strength of Umar. That is also Khalid ibn Waleed, the same type of physical stature, which is completely what we would expect, being the general that he is. You can't be a general and not have that type of body structure. Now the Banu Makhzum, which is his tribe, the Banu Makhzum were known for being the most well-trained in the arts of war. The Banu Makhzum prided themselves on their elite training. And the Banu Makhzum typically also had the best weapons and lances and spears. This probably goes back to the money that they had. And so Khalid grew up being trained by the same people that trained the fellow Banu Makhzum. So the Banu Makhzum were skilled in the arts of war. And Khalid grew up at a young age, basically learning to ride the horses and using spears and bows and arrows and lances. And therefore his capacity to, if you like, be strategic and tactful is coming from an early age. He did not participate in the Battle of Badr because his father had sent him on a trading expedition, so he actually missed the Battle of Badr completely. The next time we hear of course, Khalid is in the Battle of Uhud. I don't need to tell you what he did in the Battle of Uhud. That is everybody's knowledge, right? Khalid ibn Waleed was the one who doubled back, and he was the one who inflicted and did everything. And this shows us his military genius. It shows us at a young age already, he is far senior to and much more knowledgeable, and also opportunist, looking at where to strike, when to strike. Nobody else is thinking like he's thinking. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use this for the benefit of the ummah. So we know what happened in the Battle of Uhud. I don't need to go into all of that. In the Battle of Khandaq as well, and by the way, so who was the ones in charge of Uhud? Is Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan appointed two main sub-commanders, and they were Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl and Khalid ibn al-Waleed. And of course, Ikrimah and Khalid are not just best of friends, but also cousins. So the two of them are put in charge, and you know what happens in the Battle of Uhud. I don't need to tell you all of that. In the Battle of the Trench as well, Khalid is assigned one of the flanks. So the fact that the Quraysh are giving him leadership positions indicates his status is already known to them. His military genius, his acumen is already known to them. And so in the Battle of Ahzab, Khalid is assigned one of the contingents, and it is Khalid's army and Khalid's contingent that is the only one that manages to break through the defenses and get to the other side. They broke the defenses of the Ahzab, and they managed to bring a small troop to the other side. Then the Muslims surrounded them, and they debated amongst themselves. They decided to retreat back. But the fact is, they did break into the defenses, unlike everybody else. So once again, Khalid demonstrates his acumen, his knowledge, and he is one of the very few who actually breaks into the side of the Muslims. Khalid as well is sent at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Quraysh send him to block the Prophet ﷺ from entering Mecca. Okay, so remember Hudaybiyah, they think they're going to do Umrah. And the Prophet ﷺ is coming with 1,400 of the Sahaba, as we know. And Khalid is sent to essentially stop his entry into Mecca. And the Prophet ﷺ actually outmaneuvers Khalid and manages to bypass Khalid and then camp a stone's throw outside of Mecca, which is Hudaybiyah. They did not even want the Prophet ﷺ to get that close. Hudaybiyah is literally outside Mecca. They wanted to stop him further out. Now this is really interesting because it shows us that no matter how genius and smart Khalid was, obviously our Prophet ﷺ outsmarted him. Our Prophet ﷺ outsmarted him, and he did not allow Khalid to stop them. He rather took evasionary tactics and managed to get around Khalid and then get essentially right to almost the door of Mecca, which is Hudaybiyah, which is the plain right outside of Mecca. And it was the next year, so this is Hudaybiyah took place, the treaty took place the 6th year. In the 7th year, of the Hijrah, this is when Khalid really began to think of converting to Islam. And eventually, of course, he meets up with Amr ibn al-As and Uthman ibn Talha. Okay? And they also had decided, as we went over their stories as well, they also had decided to convert to Islam and leave in the middle of the night. And this three, as we said over and over again, is the last batch of converts before the conquest of Mecca. And his brother welcomes him, and the Prophet ﷺ is very eager to welcome him back. And within a few weeks, within a month and a half, the Battle of Mu'tah is taking place. The Battle of Mu'tah. And the Prophet ﷺ had appointed Zayd. He appointed Zayd as the commander. And he says, if Zayd is killed, then Ja'far. And if Ja'far is killed, then Abdullah bin Rawaha. And I mean, khalas, 3 is enough. I mean, how much more do you need, right? Of course, what happens when you get to the Battle of Mu'tah and the Romans are prepared, and this was the first time the Muslims met the actual Romans, right? Actual Roman soldiers participated in the Battle of Mu'tah. This was the first time the Muslims interacted with the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and they were not expecting the actual Byzantine Empire to come. They were expecting the Arabs, who were allies of the Byzantines, to come. But the Arabs, the tribe panicked and they called in the Roman troops, and the Muslims were not prepared to face the Roman troops. They weren't trained to face the Roman troops. And so a bloodbath ensues, and of course Zayd is killed, Ja'far is killed, and Abdullah is killed. All 3 are killed. And the Muslims do a hasty retreat, and whoever is left alive, now they need to do something. And they're surrounded and they're outnumbered 10 to 1. They have no clue what to do. And they look around and they say to Khalid ibn Waleed, you're in charge. Khalid says, I'm just a new Muslim, which he was. He's barely a month old. I'm not to that level. I'm not capable. And they insisted, we have no option. You have to be in charge. And so he takes the leadership hesitantly. So what appears to be the case is that Khalid ibn Waleed, he realized that there's no way to achieve actual victory, and that the only real victory would be to preserve the Muslim army from complete destruction, from massacre. So what did he do? He has a 2-pronged tactic. The first tactic was that he organized the army for a quick, short-term attack. And the purpose of this was to cause the Romans to stop from their onslaught. So he wanted to just launch a quick attack to pause the Romans and cause them to stop in their onslaught. And how did he do this? Again, we only have one narration, but I'm sure there were other things that he did. But one of the things that is mentioned is that he strategically positioned the archers, so that the archers were able to stop the onslaught of the Romans from coming. And so a group of archers basically were the primary method that was used. And there's no doubt that there was a direct onslaught as well. And this is mentioned by Khalid himself in Sahih Bukhari. He says that on the day of Mu'tah, 9 swords broke in my hand. 9 swords, one after the other, kept on using 9 swords until I finally only had left 1 Yemeni shield. So from this we derived that there was also an onslaught, there was also an attack on the ground, on infantry, and this was led by Khalid ibn Waleed. And what this did was that by the time night fell, the 2 armies had managed to separate themselves outside of the distance of a bow and arrow. So they are now safe from the bows and arrows throughout the night. The 2 armies are now within visual sight, but not within the sight of bows and arrows. And so when night fell, the Muslims are at least safe for the time being, and they took shelter behind a hill. And it was on that evening that finally the martyrs could be buried. So the bodies had been lying there for the entire day. So in the evening, that was when the martyrs could be buried, and the 3 of the leaders. And he then devises an ingenious tactic. And that tactic was, in the middle of the night, he sent groups of Muslims far away and told them to start arriving at particular times in the day. Okay? So it appeared from the Roman side that reinforcements were coming. When the next morning wakes up and they see 1 batch arrives, and then few hours later, another batch arrives. Then a few hours later, another batch arrives. So the impression is given that the support is coming. So the Romans pause. Because their goal was to come and attack, and that's it, they'd be done with. Kill all the Muslims. The Roman paused like, we're not going to attack, what's happening? The next night, Khalid and the troops disappear into the desert. They withdraw back. Now, this is not a victory in the sense of a political victory. It is a victory in the sense of avoiding annihilation, avoiding massacre. So the Muslims managed to survive, escape. And that's why when the Muslims returned, some of the hypocrites, those who didn't even go out fighting, they mocked Khalid ibn Waleed and the others, and they said that, oh, you fled from battle. You turned your backs on the army and you fled from battle. And the Prophet ﷺ said, he only turned his back in order to turn it back again one more time. Like, he came in order to go back. Because if he hadn't come back, then he couldn't have gone back, right? But the fact of the matter is that what Khalid ibn Waleed managed to do was to save the bulk of the Muslim army from what otherwise would have been a complete disaster or catastrophe, so much so that only a handful of Sahaba passed away. We know the names of around 15, probably another 5 or 10 whose names we do not know. So the fact of the matter is, out of 3,000 people, 1% basically passed away. 1%. And that is, alhamdulillah, a very, very great, if you like, victory in its own way, that faced with the odds that they were faced with the superior fighting power, still the fact that less than 1% of the army actually passed away and or died, and the rest of them returned. And this was also when the Prophet ﷺ called him Sayfullah. This is the title. This is the Battle of Mu'tah, is when our process. And when did he call them Sayfullah? The day that Khalid did his tactic, and weeks before they arrived back in Medina. And then he said, until one of the swords of Allah took the banner, and Allah gave them victory at his hands. حَتَّى أَخَذَهَا سَيْفٌ مِّن سُيُوفِ اللَّهِ. This phrase is in Bukhari. A sword from the swords of Allah took the banner, and Allah gave them victory. So from this we get the famous title that Khalid ibn Waleed, Sayfullah. He was one of the primary leaders of the conquest of Mecca. He was one of them that the Prophet put in charge of one of the flanks in the conquest of Mecca. When Mecca is conquered, actually the only group that actually encountered resistance was the group of Khalid ibn Waleed. And it was Khalid's group who then had to fight a few people who actually fought against them. So little bit of bloodshed occurred, and it was legitimate because they were attacked. So remember, the majority of Meccans just stayed in their houses. Khalid's entourage was attacked by a small group of mob, and they had to fight back. And so that was the only blood that was shed in the conquest of Mecca. Then the Prophet ﷺ sent him to Ta'if. He participated in Hunayn as well. So now we have, of course, Khalid ibn Waleed in the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. And as soon as Abu Bakr as-Siddiq took charge, what happened? The battle of the wars of Ridda began to take place. And the wars of Ridda, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq assigned Khalid ibn Waleed to take charge of the largest insurrections against the Muslim empire at the time. And these were from people like Tulayha al-Asadi, like Sajjah, like the Najdi tribes. And of course the most important was that of Musaylama al-Kadhab. Musaylama al-Kadhab had the largest following from the tribes of Yamama, and Khalid ibn Waleed defeated them in the battle of Yamama. And the battle of Yamama we mentioned many weeks ago. This was the battle that triggered the collection of the Quran. This was when 70 of the Huffaz died, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq decided to collect the Quran. So Khalid ibn Waleed was the primary general throughout the wars of the Ridda. Once the wars of the Ridda had subsided, and especially the biggest one, the largest one, which is the battle of Yamama under Musaylam al-Kadhab, and Yamama takes place in Najd, in Central Arabia. As soon as Yamama finishes, Abu Bakr then sends a letter to Khalid ibn Waleed and says, you have to go and fight the Persians. So from Central Arabia, Khalid goes to Persia to fight the Persians. And here is where Khalid's ascent to fame truly begins. Up until this point in time, Khalid is an above average, and he's doing great work. It is in the next 2-3 years, and it is literally in 2-3 years all of this is going to take place, where he fights over 40 battles. Each one of them is greater than the previous one, and he opens up the doors of 2 superpowers of the time, and it's going to begin right now with the sending of Khalid ibn Waleed to Sassanid Persia. And in the year 633 CE, 633 CE, which is 22 AH, this is the year now that Khalid ibn Waleed is now battling in the province of what is now Iraq, what is now southern Iraq, and a number of battles takes place. I have decided not to go over each and every battle because that would honestly get very boring and very technical, but we're just going to mention 2 or 3 famous incidents in particular, or 2 or 3 tactics that Khalid used in the battles that he participated in Iraq. And the battles in Iraq, they conquered the major cities on the borders of Arabia and Iraq, and the province of Anbar, the city of Hira. All of these were conquered in the first year that Khalid is sent to Iraq. And in the very first of these battles, it's called the Battle of Chains. The Battle of Chains, the Ma'rakat al-Salasil. And why is it called the Battle of Chains? It's called the Battle of Chains, Dhatu Salasil, because the Persian Empire decided to chain their soldiers up in ranks all together, so that they could act like a fortress together. So all of the Persian soldiers were actually chained together to form a solid block. Now, Khalid's forces were much smaller than those of the Sassanids, the Persians. And the Sassanids were better equipped. They were better armed. They had thicker armor as well. This is Persian artillery, Persian warfare, Persian armor. The leader of the Persians, his name was Hurmuz, and Hurmuz was killed in a one-on-one with Khalid ibn Waleed. Khalid challenged him to a duel, and this was another tactic of Khalid, because the Arabs had this tactic of duels. So Khalid would always challenge one of their leaders, and obviously Khalid, being who he is, he manages to kill the leader, even though, by the way, Hurmuz tried to do a sly plot which was illegal, and that is to have some of his armed guards attack Khalid. Technically it's supposed to be one-on-one. You're not supposed to bring anybody else, and that would be cheating. But Hurmuz had told his elite bodyguards that, look, I'm just going to stand there, you guys come and you basically deal with Khalid ibn Waleed. Basically it's treachery, because that's not the rules of the game. When you have arm-to-arm combat, it's supposed to be one-on-one. But Hurmuz decided to betray this, and Amr ibn al-As and others, they saw this from afar, that something is happening. So they essentially brought a contingent and they defeated the armed guards before they came, and Hurmuz and Khalid had a one-on-one, and Hurmuz could not win against Khalid ibn al-Waleed, and Khalid ended up killing Hurmuz. And with the death of Hurmuz, the entire Sassanid army was obviously traumatized, taken into chaos, and they were tied hand to hand, foot to foot. So they have nowhere to run. And so Khalid's forces decimated them. There was a massive victory for the ranks of the Muslims. And this led Khalid to the next battle, and this is called the Battle of Dhatun Nahr, or the Battle of the River. And again, interesting tactics were used. One of the tactics that Khalid used in this battle was that he utilized the element of surprise. Essentially, he arrived at the battlefield before the army had mobilized, only when parts of the army had come. He managed to travel non-stop and get to the area of the battle before the rest of the army had arrived. And the army is still setting up their camps, their battalions, their fortresses, their manjaniq, which is their catapults. They're sending all of these up, and Khalid gets there before the army finishes even setting up, much less arriving. And obviously the full army isn't even there, so Khalid manages to gain another victory as well. And this is called the Battle of the River. A third battle, the Battle of Walaja. All of these are battles that are leading to Qadisiyah. Qadisiyah is going to come. Qadisiyah is the big battle, and Khalid ibn Waleed is paving the way. In the Battle of Walaja, this is where Khalid ibn Waleed is credited with one of his most genius moves. The Battle of Walaja was one of the decisive battles in which the Roman Emperor Kisra is sending in one of the largest armies that has yet fought the Muslims. And Khalid ibn Waleed barely had a third, some say even a fourth, some say even a fifth of the army of the Persians. Always the Muslims are less than the Persians and even the Romans. And Khalid ibn Waleed undertakes a tactic that is actually a well-known and well-studied tactic to this day. And the annals of war and the books of history of war actually have a name for this tactic. And this is called the pincer movement. Pincer movement. And this pincer movement, it is mentioned by many famous military tacticians going back to Sun Tzu in The Art of War. If you know the famous Chinese general who wrote one of the first military books ever written in the history of mankind, it's called Sun Tzu's Art of War. And in The Art of War, he actually mentions this pincer tactic. He doesn't call it the pincer tactic, but he discourages it, and he says this is a dangerous tactic because it is likely that your army will flee before the end of the battle. It's that dangerous. Your own army will flee. So he discourages it. Historically speaking, this tactic has also been used by some of the greatest military commanders in the history of mankind. Alexander the Great used this tactic. Hannibal the Conqueror, who fought against the Romans. Hannibal, the famous Hannibal, one of the most famous military generals in history, who fought against the Romans and won them. He also won using this tactic, which is the pincer tactic. And to this day, in every book of war, you have chapters detailing the pincer tactic and when it was used. And Khalid ibn Waleed is mentioned as one of the people who used this tactic as well in this battle of Walaja. Now what is interesting, yes, this tactic is studied at Sandhurst, it is studied at West Point, but Khalid ibn Waleed did not go through Sandhurst. He didn't go through West Point. He did not study Sun Tzu's Art of War. He did not study Hannibal's, tactics. How did he come across this? Honestly, we have to say Allah Azza wa Jal blessed him with it. He did not go through these trainings, and yet he came across that tactic. Now, what exactly is the tactic? I've been mentioning the pincer tactic all along. What exactly is it? Well, I'm not an expert in these fields, but just in simple layman's terms, I am a layman, and I think all of us are laymen here when it comes to military tactics. So, in layman's terms, from one layman to the rest of you all, this move is basically called the pincer tactic because the goal is to pinch the army, to spread yourself thin, and to encircle or at least pinch the army from multiple sides. Now this is a huge risk and gamble because in order to do that, you have to spread extra thin. So if you are fortified and you have rows of 100, let's say, to do the pincer tactic, you're going to have to go down to rows of 20 maybe. So you have to spread very thin. And what this means is your casualties will be great. And that's why Sun Tzu said it should not really be done because it will lead to a lot of massacres, or your troops might flee. But what is the positive? The positive is that you're able to maximize a small group against a larger group, and you throw the larger group into chaos because they are not expecting to be attacked from the sides. They're expecting to be attacked from the front. All armies line up to attack from the front back, and they have their techniques and their tactics, and they have the arrows in the back and the lances in the front and the swords in the middle. They have a row in this manner, right? The pincer tactic essentially disrupts the layers of an army, and it brings about a chaos by attacking from the sides rather than from the front. And this is very dangerous because, as I said, you have to make yourself very thin in order to maximize your potential against the army. Well, in this case, it worked, and it was a resounding victory. It was a resounding victory, and therefore this battle becomes one of the standard battles that is studied to this day in many books of histories of battles and war tactics about how to use the pincer effect to the maximum advantage. And again, it's interesting, Khalid Ibn Waleed never studied this. It just was something that Allah blessed him with. And one of the battles as well was the battle of Ulais, which was really they said this was the bloodiest battle ever fought up until that point in time in Islamic history. It was a fierce battle, and Khalid ibn Waleed decided to do something that was to prove controversial among some later historians, but at the time it makes complete sense. He basically said after he won the battle, no prisoners of war. And what does that mean? Everybody was executed. What's the point of doing that at this point in time? What is the wisdom? this is meant to inflict fear in the ranks of the Sassanids, because he has an empire to conquer. Remember, we still haven't even come to Qadisiyah. This is pre-Qadisiyah, right? And he's winning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mini battles, and his troops are not enough to take on the entire Sassanid empire. He needs to send a message. And in this battle, there is no doubt that a lot of people were killed. After Khalid won, the standard tactic is to take prisoners of war. Now the Sharia, now we talked about this many times, like, look, Islamic law is different from modern warfare. And what should a modern Muslim country do in modern warfare is something that modern scholars have to discuss. And it is my opinion that yes, we are allowed to go and rethink through these laws, no problem. Well, this is one of those things that essentially, when the Muslims won, Khalid said, no prisoners this time. This time, no prisoners. So essentially, maybe 10,000 people. And these are all, by the way, these are not civilians, these are clearly army people. I mean, we're not talking about killing civilians, but nonetheless, the Geneva Convention would say, once the war is over, what should you do? Take them prisoners, treat them humanely until whatever needs to be done. You know, imprison them, then hand them back, whatever needs to be done. Well, that's the Geneva Convention. Pre-Geneva Convention, there was no such law in place, and Khalid radiallahu anhu made an ijtihad, which is fully legitimate for the time and place. And it had the desired impact. Even Kisra retreated back into the land. It had the desired impact that you're sending the message that we are not a trivial force. Barely a year ago, it was the Roman emperor, sorry, it was the Persian general that was saying to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, what are you doing here? Go back. Remember? He was the one. What are you doing here? Go back. We're going to ignore this ever happened. Now the Muslims are here and they're sending the message that we are going to stay. So Khalid ibn Waleed essentially opens the way up to conquer the capital of the Sassanid Empire. And please, everybody should know, what is the capital of the Sassanid Empire? Madain, which is in English Ctesiphon. Okay, Madain, Ctesiphon. This is the capital of the Sassanid Empire, Ctesiphon. And Khalid ibn Waleed paves the way to capture Ctesiphon, Madain. But he shall not have that honor. Why? What happens?